Morning, everyone. Good morning. And I thought we will discuss comparing Labour and Conservative policies. It would be quite useful. I think we end up spending quite a lot of time talking about Conservative policies and Conservative policies. And the main reason for that is because the Conservatives are in government, when the Conservatives have a policy, it's like, go on, do it then. Whereas when Labour have a policy, it's more of a case of, okay, but will that still be your policy when you can put it into action? Because when Labour announce a policy, they can't put it into action then. The earliest they can put it into action is when they form a government. We don't even know when that is. We suspect in about a year's time. Could be a year and a half's time. Who knows? Could be half a year's time. Could be 3 months' time. So it's always a little bit different because all we can ever say when we're talking about Labour policies is what is their policy at the moment. But at the same time, if we wait for it to be completely solidified in the form of a manifesto, we'll be waiting till just a few weeks before the election. So we may as well get going now. And the topic is a very dirty topic today, indeed. The topic is going to be water qualities. Well, basically dealing with water companies. And the reason I want to do more of this, I'm gonna make an effort to do more of this. I see that Phil isn't disguised Graham today, no hat. No, I know there's no hat. I only wore a hat when I was pretending to be Graham. But it's Tuesday. Tuesday and Thursday is when the days when I pretend to be me. So yes, I thought because you'll see a lot of people who will say, "Oh, what's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives? What's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives?" And for some of those people, I get quite irritated because I'm thinking to myself, well, you say you're like a professor of law or a professor of economics, or you're just someone who has a really keen interest in politics. It's like, well, you should therefore know what the Labour policies are, what the Conservative policies are, and you should see they're very different. But I totally understand it from the point of view of the majority of the public, because, you know, as we keep saying, the reason for this channel is Labour's messaging is not that brilliant. So let us have a little look at the difference. So let's look at the Tories' policies first of all. So in terms of dealing with sewage discharges, and I will point out, this is not like dealing with poverty, where the Conservatives don't care because they're not really trying to attract voters who are, although they have now plunged a great many of their actual voters into poverty. So I suppose they have to care a little bit more about it these days. But traditionally they don't. If they aim to target the poor, which they did in 2019, most unusually, it is only to try and persuade them to vote to be poorer still. But let's look at the Conservatives' plan, because they do have a policy on dealing with sewage discharges. And there's two aspects to the policy. The first is to let water companies carry on discharging raw sewage for another 20 to 30 years. So their policy is to set targets, long-term targets, that will eventually by 2030, 2040, something like that, 2050 even, maybe have a reduction in raw sewage dumping. But, and I'll point this out, the only way a target on water companies will work, because remember, this is not like setting a target for the NHS, where the Department for Health and Social Care is largely in control, although the great deal of it is now privatised. With water companies, they're entirely privatised. So if the government set a target, you need to go, well, okay, so where are your regulatory teeth? So Ofwat is the ombudsman. So what is the Conservatives' policy to give Ofwat more powers to crack down on non-compliance? None at all. So when the Conservatives say, well, we're setting a target so that raw sewage dumping should end in about 20 years, it's like, yeah, setting a target's not going to do anything unless you force them. Then there's the second part of their policy, which is to charge the public extra, us, extra, to pay for the infrastructure. Because remember, the water companies keep saying, oh, it's not our problem, it's the crumbling Victorian infrastructure. And it's like, yeah, when Thatcher privatised it all, she said they would modernise that crumbling Victorian infrastructure. So why didn't you? Why have you managed to raise all these debts and you haven't actually tackled that? 30 years. It's been privatised for a good 30 years. More, really. When was it exactly? It was over 30 years ago, wasn't it? And where's this infrastructure, this modern infrastructure? So no, the government are now saying, oh, we didn't do the infrastructure, sorry. Well, we're going to do the infrastructure now, but you're going to have to pay extra for it, right? I'll tell you what, do you know what water companies are like? Do you know what they remind me of? You know how sometimes like someone, like a parent will say to their kid, like, it's your nana's birthday coming up, right? Go and get her something nice. Here's a tenner, go and buy her a birthday present. And this selfish little brat robs a few flowers from the park and then spends the tenner on themselves, right? That's what a water company's like. You know, they've spent 30 years, somehow, again, shouldn't be allowed. How have they been allowed to rack up debts when they haven't used that money to invest? It's not like they've borrowed to invest in modern infrastructure, because we haven't got the modern infrastructure. They keep saying, we've still got the Victorian infrastructure. So how have they been allowed to rack up debts to basically just pay out huge dividends? You know, in a normal business, they'd be going to prison. This would be malfeasance, wouldn't it? But this is the Conservatives' policy. We'll go through a few little comments before we go on to Labour's, just to highlight for people what is the difference. Ed saying, well, I absolutely despise the rhetoric from Teresa Coffey. Yeah, so she, for those who don't know, she's the Secretary of State in charge of DEFRA. So she is the one who is now dealing with this, or the Cabinet Minister dealing with this. Also, the water company should absolutely not pass on the cost to the public. I mean, when it was privatised, it was understood that it would be part of our bill. They weren't going to magic up money from nowhere. But the point is that we've been paying high prices and they've been racking up debts. They've been borrowing. And we don't have it. Like I said, they're like the kid. You've given them a tenner to get the nana a birthday present and they've spent it on themselves. That's what water companies are like. They're like spoilt children. So what do you do in that situation? You don't say, oh, here's another tenner, go, you little scamp, go and get another one. No, you say, right, you needed to have done that. You need to make them pay for it. You need to get them to work it off or something like that. But anyway... but yeah, Teresa Coffey is apparently trying to claim that the water's it's cleaner than it was under Labour. It's like it's not even cleaner than it was under Cameron, for goodness sake. Shades of the railways, we pay for the infrastructure despite privatisation supposedly sorting it out. Yeah, well, it's the same with all of it, isn't it? You can point to, if I think about everything that's been privatised, which is basically everything now, which public service is now running better? None of them at all. None of them are running better. Buses aren't running better, the worse, in fact, because what happens is when you prioritise profit, you take off unprofitable services. So trains, now they're not technically allowed to, they've got to have so many services, but they just cancel them. They used last year the strikes as an excuse, but they were cancelling them on days when there weren't strikes, or indeed days anywhere near when there were strikes. They just cancelled the unprofitable services. And one of them, I can't remember which one it was now, was particularly egregious at it because they were cancelling it in a way that didn't count on their stats. It's like if you cancel it at a certain time, so much notice, it doesn't count as a cancellation on your stats. It's like, well, no, if you cancel a service, it should always count on the stats. You know, it's like you're supposed to be providing these services, and these services are already much diminished from what they were. Our rail network is very poor. I don't just mean the quality of the service. I just mean the network. The town I live in, it's not a big, it's like a small old market town, but there's no railway station. There is no railway station. In fact, where I live, a place called Epworth, and there's another town stuck to it called Belton, right? There's no railway station there either. There's no railway station anywhere near me. Nowhere near me. I cannot get to a railway station unless I drive to one. And if you think, oh, get the bus. Oh, yeah, good one. There's not many buses. There's like a couple of buses a day and they're to different places. So basically, if you want to get to a place, there's like a bus. I think Fergal Sharkey said that when there's a traffic jam, we don't blame the Romans who put the road there, and we should be blaming, shouldn't be blaming the Victorian infrastructure for the water problem. Yeah, precisely, that is exactly right. But anyway, let us move on. So what is Labour's plan? So just to remember, and if anyone thinks I'm wrong, you can quite say there, but this is absolutely what the Conservatives' policies are. It is to set targets without any regulatory teeth to set targets that will mean raw sewage discharge should be reduced over a period of 20 to 30 years, and to make the public pay extra to update the infrastructure to allow these targets to be met over 20 or 30 years, right? So that's the Conservatives' plan. So Labour's, I've pulled this and I've done it word for word directly out of I've mentioned this before. There was Labour List, which is like the Labour version of Conservative Home. It's a website that publishes Labour-related stuff. And they published what was at the time, this was a few months ago, the current state of Labour's manifesto. Now, I will keep pointing out, this is this difference. When Labour have a policy, it could, of course, change before they're in a position to do it. But as things stand now, this is their plan. So first of all, I ought to, let's move that above me. I thought I'd sorted this out, I hadn't. Use regulatory powers to keep consumer bills down and ensure that water companies, rather than public, pay for their failures. So what that means is, first of all, the talking about regulatory powers means giving Ofwat more teeth to force them to keep consumer bills down. Now, we have a bit of a problem at the moment where the Ombudsman keep allowing these companies, energy companies, water companies, whatever, to keep raising their prices without any performance targets attached to that. In other words, they're not forcing the companies to deliver extra value for the extra cost, right? This is saying, no, we'll keep them down. But then this is an interesting point. Ensure that water companies rather than public pay for their failures. What does that mean? Well, we have a system at the moment where water companies fail to meet certain targets, they can be fined. It's like, you're discharging too much sewage. Here's a fine, right? At the moment, what the water companies do is, oh dear, we'd better put up the prices to pay for this fine then. This is Labour saying, no, you won't be doing that. If we fine you, we're fining you, not your customers. Okay, so that's number one. They will be paying for their fines. It will not be passed on to the consumer. Next one, set mandatory targets to halve water leaks, right? And then strike off company directors who continually breach and ignore their responsibilities. So what they're saying is, again, and that's, I want some criminal offences built in here, but nonetheless, this is quite a big stick because they make a lot of money. And if Labour are basically saying, if you keep failing to meet these targets, you will be struck off. That means they can't work as company directors. Well, they can go to another country if they want, if another country will have them. But they will not be plying their trade in this country. So that is quite a big one. You know, that is putting the executives in personal threat, because that way they can't just grab. Because the problem at the moment, because they're very profit focused, because they're beholden to the shareholders, not because the government play too light a touch on them, and they arrange to have bonuses. They get themselves huge bonuses for short-term gains. So if I meet these targets in the next year or two. So their focus is very short-term, grab profit short-term. There is nothing that encourages the executives running these water companies to plan for the long term, because their bonuses are not attached. They don't get a bonus for doing something well in 20 years' time. So this is basically a case of, if you want to, and they'll think, well, if something goes wrong, well, they'll just leave and go work for a different company. This is like saying, no, you won't. If you want to work as a company director, if you want to be allowed to work as a company director, you will do your job diligently. And your job is to deliver the service. Yes, your shareholders demand that you produce dividends, but your job is to provide a service. Third one, ensure illegal activity is punished and ensure, there's that hides a multitude of sins, doesn't it? So that might imply that maybe there will be criminal, because illegal activity doesn't necessarily mean criminal. It could just be fines, but it opens the way for them to create criminal offences, I suppose. But ensure illegal activity is punished and ensure payments of dividends are linked to key performance metrics. In other words, if you do not meet this service, you will not be paying out dividends. Now, I'll tell you why I like this. In fact, I'll come to John Bull's little statement before I say, because it's touching on it. Could Labour's policy trigger a mass exodus of shareholders if they see dividends being reduced or eliminated? Is that a cheap way to renationalisation? This is exactly my thought. See, if the likes of Thames Water, for example, the largest water company that's going belly up, right? They're basically highlighting that this privatisation there's no viable business model for it. Well, let's have a nationalised business model then. When it comes to nationalising public services again, like people say, we should nationalise it. It's like, but what do you mean by that? How will you do it? Well, we'll just spend a load of money to pay off the shareholders. Yeah, that's how you lose the next election. So that's not happening. It needs to be done on the cheap. So we know that Labour will be nationalising the railways on the cheap because they've said they will just, as soon as the contracts come up, they will just not renew them. They'll just take them into public hands. That works for the railways, doesn't work for water companies. So, because there is no like, we'll take it back into public hands when a contract, there's no contract. So, or at least not like a short-term one. So what we need to do is for the privatisation to fail. Just it's the reverse of the Tories' trick with the NHS. They're trying to make nationalisation fail, even though they're doing it by privatising it. It's actually sick, I think, the way they treat the NHS, because they're using privatisation to make it appear that nationalisation is failing, but it's the other way around. Well, make privatisation fail with the water companies. Say to them, you're going to prioritise this service. We're going to force you to prioritise the service. If you can make money out of it, fine, no problem. But if you can't, piss off. And then, yes, we need to be able to, if they collapse, we need to take them over without taking their debts. That is the key thing for me. And what we absolutely don't do is pay off the shareholders, right? I don't even want to take on the debts, but we do not pay off the shareholders with this. And that is exactly my thinking. Something like this will make it a less attractive proposition for shareholders. So they will, particularly pension funds is the big one. Like if private shareholders go under because a like a privatised service goes under, well, buyer beware, that's on them. But the problem is pension funds invest in things like this, and the government cannot allow pension funds to fail. So as soon as pension funds disappear from the equation, it's much safer for the government to allow them to fail and take them to public hands. So that third one, yes, for me, that is the nationalisation by stealth measure. If the water company is not allowed to pay out dividends or not much, because it doesn't matter, even if they pay out some, if it's not enough, if it's not the best investment, then the likes of the pension funds, the investment funds, will move somewhere else, right? They'll abandon water. So that, yes, that to me basically says, and Labour can calibrate it. They can calibrate it to avoid a catastrophic collapse, but to make it uncomfortable. So, because the government will decide what those metrics are. Off what technically, I suppose, will be deciding them. But the thing about an ombudsman is it's the government that set their guidelines. And then the final one, introduce mandatory monitoring of sewage outlets. So Liz Truss was the minister at the time, but David Cameron's government removed a lot of the monitoring. It's a bit like, oh, you can't attack us for poor water quality if we're not monitoring water quality, can you? So basically, boost that back up, because we stopped a lot of water monitoring, quality monitoring. So boost it back up, and automatic fines for sewage discharges. So in other words, like the water companies at the moment are saying, you can't help it. There's certain times when we can't help it. Labour will be saying here, yeah, okay, we get that, but it is your fault for not building the infrastructure. But we think there's times when you're dumping just because it's more profitable. We think there's times when you're dumping you don't have to. And that's absolutely the case, because think about it. We didn't get all of this sewage dumping before. We got some. We didn't get it on this scale. This has happened since Brexit, right? This has specifically happened since 2021 and the Environment Act 2021, when the government basically allowed them, right? Labour will be saying, no. Every time there's a discharge, you're going to get a fine. So if it's only happening when it absolutely has to, you'll take the hit. But we're going to make, basically they're saying we're going to make it unprofitable to discharge untreated sewage, right? So just to point out, untreated sewage, obviously we know it's discharged, but it's supposed to be treated first. With a penalty for outlets that do not have monitoring in place. So if they're not monitoring it either, then they'll be fined for that too. And remember, going back to the top one, they will not be passing on the cost of the fines to their customers. That is the difference. Well, people say, oh, what's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives? And you can do this for any policy area. When it comes to water quality, that is the difference. The Conservatives, we're going to set targets. Are you going to enforce those targets? No, we're just going to set them. Don't we need better infrastructure to pay for those to meet those targets? Yeah, we'll get better infrastructure. The customers will pay for that, pay extra for that. That's what the Conservatives are proposing. Labour are going, no. The bills will not be going up to pay for this because they're already making enough money, right? They will pay for it. If it costs them their dividends, tough. If they don't work properly to develop the better infrastructure, then they will be fined. So the Labour are basically saying we will make it so that it is not profitable to. The only way it's profitable is to meet the service. That's what Labour are saying. The only way you are going to make a profit is by doing your job. And also, if an individual executive thinks, well, sod it, I'm not investing in this company, I will just grab what money I can and then leave. It's like, well, we will strike you off. You won't be working anywhere else in this country. Well, you can work, stacking shelves in Tesco, but you ain't going to work as a company director. Could we charge the shareholders with the debt? Would that ring fence the pensions when the company is renationalised? No, I don't. I mean, I'm not an expert in how anything like this works. I've no real knowledge of how sort of takeovers like this would work. All I know is if we have to take on, like, paying off shareholders a massive price won't work because that'll just load up the national debt and we won't see the benefit for 20 years and Labour will lose the very next election. Taking on the debt arguably is not as bad, but it is still, it depends on what those debts are. I mean, let's just have a quick squint at how much the debt is. So if we look at the big one, Thames Water, what is their debt hole? 14 billion. And that's just, okay, it's the biggest water company. That's just one water company. 14 billion pounds of debt. That's a hell of a lot. At a time where Labour are going to have to try and balance the books by talking about, £1 billion here and £1 billion there, getting rid of tax breaks. 14 billion for one water company. So we really could do with we shouldn't be taking on the debt if we can help it. But I just don't know legally whether they can get away with that, whether they would have to take on the debt or not. I think the debt could certainly be lowered. I don't think they would take on all 14 billion of it, but they may have to take on some. Should Labour insist on annual infrastructure investment targets to ensure progress is made on improving infrastructure? Absolutely, certainly. Again, it's, but the way I read this, the way Labour will come about it, and obviously, again, we won't know the detail till they're doing it. It sounds to me like they'll be saying to the water companies, you can handle it however you like, but you will make sure there's monitoring. Like at the bottom it says, if there's an outlet where there's no monitoring, we will punish you financially, right? And if you're discharging raw sewage, we will punish you financially. If you do not meet these targets, you will not be allowed to pay out dividends. So Labour, it's the way I read it is Labour are going to say to the water companies, you handle it however you like. You do whatever you like. We're not going to tell you how to run your business. What we are going to tell you is that you are not allowed to make a profit until you've paid your expenses. So it won't necessarily be that Labour will force them to have annual progress targets as such, because the water companies will have to have them in order to stop being fined into oblivion. David's saying, has Anne Widdecombe been swimming in those waters? Now, don't be unkind. All new or renewed infrastructure has to separate rainwater from sewage water. This would fix a lot of the sewage problems long term. Yeah. It's an absolute shamble. We really have had 3 decades of them. And again, it's what happens. A private company focuses on profit. And it's like, if we separate out a private company, a normal private company, like if you or I were to set up like a shop, a corner shop or something, right? And compare that to a public service, that a privatized public service for which you just got like a tender from the government at one time. The the corner shop you run, if you run it badly, it will just fail. The government won't bail you out. You will just fail and someone will buy the shop and run it better. Whereas the water company cannot fail because people need the water. So the government, and if the government are not doing what Labour are proposing here, they will completely take the piss. They will prioritise profit, knowing full well it's almost like Rishi Sunak, way he made his money, gambling with other investment bankers, gambling with other people's money. Every time they win their gamble, they keep the profits. Every time they lose, they get bailed out because the government cannot afford pension funds to collapse. Which is why it's still staggering to me that they allowed Liz Truss to do just that. You know, the damage she did to pension funds last autumn was absolutely horrendous. How Tory MP stood back and allowed it to happen is it just shows they have got no idea how finances work. But anyway, are they using pensions to protect the criminal actions, aka pension shielding, like holding a baby in front of them to stop people from shooting them? Sort of, yeah. I mean, with any government, yes, even a Labour government, that works. I would say with the current Tory government, it doesn't even need to be that because the Tories just are letting them do what they want anyway. Now, if any sort of Labour government were in power, they wouldn't be, but they would all. It's a bit like, if you think back to the banking crisis, why did the government bail the banks out? To save the pension funds. It was really that simple. That is why the government, and you know, I will give Gordon Brown his due. He did say that he regretted not prosecute. We should have at least prosecuted the main offenders, and we didn't. And he did say that was a regret later. But at the time, what they were doing was making sure that people, well, also people's deposit accounts wasn't wiped out, but it was to stop pension funds being wiped out. And they know that. They know we can't let them disappear. But with a situation like this with the water companies, if Labour squeeze to the point where the pension funds just move their investments, as soon as there's no pension funds involved, like any other investments are, because there are some private investment, if it's like, you know, just a normal private investment, a Labour government don't have to worry if that goes out because it's like, well, you were gambling. You're an investor, you gamble, right? And it's an individual investor who loses out. And a Labour government can be comfortable with that. Well, you bet, you know, you gambled, you spun the roulette wheel and you lost, you know, deal with it. But pension funds, that's different. This is an example of why you need a written or codified constitution. It's absolutely not. To define public interest in goods. No, because who would write it? The government of the day. No. Also, this sort of stuff happens in America, not as egregiously as this, but I would say the only reason it doesn't happen as badly as this in America is because you've got proper devolution in America. Individual states have a great deal of power. So the entire country is not going to have bad legislatures in every single of their dozens of states. And America has a written and codified constitution. Can you imagine? You know, no. Absolutely not. Is it not? Hang on. Is it not so that the only way for a shareholder to bail is to sell his shares? Would anyone then buy the shares if there's no profit? I mean, someone will always buy them if they're low enough, but it really doesn't matter. The point is to try and encourage, from my point of view anyway, I mean, I don't know what Labour are talking about privately, but from my point of view, I look at that third one and think, this is a good way to encourage investment funds to move. And as soon as the important investment funds, the ones that the government have to protect, are moved, then it's open season. It's like Dodge City. Please do a video explaining how the Tories have already privatised the NHS. I do these from time to time. It's bound to come up at some point. I tend to try and do it when it's a little bit more topical. But I am going to try and make more of a conscious effort to do these comparisons of Conservative and Labour policies, because it does irk me when people are going, oh, well, what's the difference? But then Labour aren't good at explaining the difference either. Their messaging is not great either. Let's hack all Tories' bank accounts and create a pension scheme from British population. I don't think I should be supporting criminal activity. Hacking bank accounts would be very naughty. Even Nigel Farage's. Our water and sewage infrastructure requires huge investment. I do worry that if privatised, the Chancellor will fail to come up with the necessary nationalised. It'll have to happen. The thing is as well, like, it's one of these weird things where the government, like, this is why I don't understand why the Conservatives are so in favour of unregulated privatisation. Because, all right, we've got a load of sewage dumping going on, right? Who do the public blame? The government. The government don't get to say, well, it's privatised. Well, they try, but it doesn't work. It's like, well, you're the government. Deal with it. It's a public service. So people, even people who don't mind privatisation, they still expect the government to make sure the service is delivered. So it doesn't matter how much you privatise a public service, the government are still deemed responsible by voters. Because what can voters do? What can customers do? Like, if you're with, say, Thames Water, what can you do? Nothing. You can't go with someone else. There's no competition. So what can you do? Nothing. But you can vote for a different party at the election, so you can hold the government to account. So, and the same will apply to Labour. It doesn't matter whether it's nationalised or privatised. The government will be made responsible by voters for the quality of the service. So they will have to. Doesn't matter whether it's privatised or nationalised. The government have to make sure, particularly a Labour government. A Labour government always have to make sure that the service is being delivered. But anyway, there we go. Run out of time on that one. I will just come to this last point from Paul. It says, is water pollution primarily a consequence of Brexit? There were always discharges, but hasn't this become uncontrolled since the chemicals needed for treatment become more difficult to obtain? It is to do with Brexit, and partly it is to do with the fact that, yes, it is now more difficult to get the chemicals, but it is also partly because what would normally happen if we were in the EU, this would not be happening, not just because of access to chemicals, but more because it would be illegal. We would not have been able to pass the Environment Act 2021 as it is because the EU demands certain standards of water. We would be taken to court. The European Court of Justice would be involved and they'd be bollocking us. So, as used to happen every now and then, because water quality has been an issue in the past, as you say, and what would happen is if it kept getting bad, then we'd be taken to court. Now we won't be, because the European Court of Justice don't have any jurisdiction over Britain, Northern Ireland, yes, but not Britain. And British courts can't do anything because the government, the Tories legislated to allow it in the Environment Act 2021. But anyway, we will leave it there anyway. Thank you very much for coming on. Have a very good day. And until next time, I'll see you later.